Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our conversation today with Glenn Adamson. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Anya Kivarkis, and I'm the head of jewelry and metalsmithing here at the University of Oregon. Our guest, Glenn Adamson, is a curator, writer, and historian based in New York. He's previously been the director of the Museum of Arts and Design in New York, the head of research at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and a curator at the Chipstone Foundation in Milwaukee. He is currently co-host of the online interview series Design and Dialogue, so you can also give that a listen. Adamson's publications include Thinking Through Craft in 2007, The Craft Reader in 2010, Postmodernism, Style and Subversion, co-edited with Jane Pavitt in 2011, The Invention of Craft in 2013, Art in the Making, co-authored with Julia Bryan-Wilson, who was also one of our visiting lecturers maybe 2 years ago. You can watch her lecture in 2016, and Fewer Better Things, The Hidden Wisdom of Objects in 2018. His newest book is Craft, an American History, which we'll discuss today. In addition to the UO Department of Art, this event was co-sponsored by the PNCA Applied Craft and Design Program and the Robert James Ceramics Foundation here at the University of Oregon. So welcome to Sarah Houston, who heads the program at PNCA and the PNCA community. I had the privilege of joining them for studio visits recently, and they're such a vibrant and amazing community. So I'm glad that you're here. And thank you for co-sponsoring the event with us. So we want to acknowledge that the University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Ilihi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, Kalapuya descendants are primarily citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Rod and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians. They continue to make important contributions to their communities, to the U of O, to Oregon, and to the world. So for this event, Glenn will give a presentation about his recent book, and then I'll join him in conversation, and then we'll take questions from the audience at the end. So please do feel free to post your questions into the Q&A rather than the chat today. And Glenn, I've been interested in your work for so long. It's such an absolute pleasure to have you here with us today. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Glenn Adamson, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Glenn. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anya. And likewise, in fact, I have to say that my lecture tonight or this afternoon for you on the West Coast is really in many ways inspired by your work, because there are so many different ways that you could cut a slice through this book that I'll be talking about. And because so much of your work has gravitated to this idea of different registers of reality, some of which are physical, some of which are symbolic or virtual, I thought that would be a really interesting way to kind of tackle the question of American craft over the last few centuries. Before I get to that, though, let me also join in your very appropriate land acknowledgement and say that I'm sitting in the Hudson River Valley, just west of the river. And this, of course, used to be one of the main thoroughfares of the Iroquois Confederacy, more properly called the Haudenosaunee people. And as you'll see, I'm going to be speaking a lot about Native American culture in the lecture this evening. It's one of the main themes of the book. And so maybe that makes it all the more appropriate, but certainly I think it's always absolutely vital that we realize that we're all squatters here, unless we actually have indigenous background. And that story is absolutely interwoven to the story of American craft. So let me go ahead and start some images. I'm going to just begin by showing the cover of the book, which might seem like, just naked self-promotion, but I'm doing it partly because of the two images that are on the cover. I was really happy to be able to feature them in this way. The one at the bottom is the more recent of the two. It's a quilt, and it was made in 1983 by Jessie Telfair, who was a Alabama-based civil rights worker. And although it was made in the 80s, it's very much looking back to her experience in the 1960s. And I like to think of this quilt as a kind of materialized chant, almost like the kind of rhythmic sort of meter that you would have vocalized by a protest march in the 1960s. It's very interesting to me that the word freedom is repeated 7 times, and yet each of the versions of the word are slightly different. So it's got that variation or individualism that we associate with the idea of the handmade, of course. And that maybe is the most important theme of this book that I've written, which covers the period from the American Revolutionary War to the present day, with some allusions back before the war to talk, in fact, precisely about the initial encounters between Native people and white settlers. It's also a really interesting image to me, this one, because it is a quilt, and so soft, hand sewn, you could imagine it on a bed, and yet it's obviously a very explicitly political object and an object of protest. And it's a very interesting pairing for me with the other image that's on the cover, which is, of course, John Singleton Copley's painting of Paul Revere. And I imagine that many of you will know this painting. It's one of the most famous 18th century paintings, one that Copley made before he actually fled the revolution to London because he was a loyalist, essentially. So he was not necessarily on the side of the revolutionaries, but boy, Paul Revere sure was. I'm sure you all know the story of his midnight ride. And so he was, very much, again, a craftsperson who was involved in activist politics. And so although the quilt and the painting, or indeed the teapot that Revere is holding there, which you see in more detail here, are objects that seem to come from the far extremities of American history. So an 18th century object, a 20th century object, work made in a rather elite decorative art context by a white man living in the North. And then, of course, a much more vernacular seeming object made by a Black woman in the South. You can see that they actually have a lot in common. And in fact, even the word freedom that Jessie Telfair is placing at the center of her work is the very term that Revere and his compatriots in the revolutionary generation would have claimed for their own political beliefs. It's also really interesting to note, and this is me getting into the theme of the evening, really, the reflection in the teapot. And this is not an original observation with me, it's been pointed out by many other art historians. But it is fascinating that Copley is painting Revere's hand, not his left hand, that is, not once but twice, once as a real hand and once as a reflection. And of course, if I go back to the image, the overall image, there's also a very interesting comparison being made pictorially between Revere holding the teapot and Revere holding his own head. So two spherical objects almost being cradled, and a kind of equivalence or connection being drawn between them. And it prompts the thought that that reflection suggests that craft is already at this time being presented in a symbolic register as well as a matter of reality, a matter of material shaped skillfully through traditional craft processes. So one way you could think about that teapot is almost like a kind of film screen. Obviously, an anachronistic analogy, but I think a really good one, because it suggests that a craft object is not only serviceable and utilitarian, obviously you can pour tea out of it, but it's also something you can project onto and you can make mean something. Now, what's fascinating to note is that actually, I don't know if this is really still true, but certainly as recently as the 70s, and there were surveys done that I found that attested to this, the most famous craftspeople, the most famous Americans of all were two craftspeople, discounting presidents like Washington and Jefferson and Lincoln, and maybe Ben Franklin, although of course he was a craftsperson too as a printer. But the two people that most people would come up with if asked to name a historic American were Paul Revere and Betsy Ross. Betsy Ross, of course, allegedly having been the designer and maker of the first US flag. It turns out that's not actually true. This is a much later painting, as you can probably tell, from the late 19th, early 20th century, that shows Ross and her sisters and friends making the first US flag. Never happened. Probably a story that was invented from whole cloth, as it were, in 1876, so a full century after the revolution, by her descendants in a sort of moment of patriotic fervor, the centenary 100th anniversary of the country's founding. But it's so fascinating to me that these two craftspeople, a silversmith and an upholsterer, which is in fact what Betsy Ross really was. She made, upholstered chairs and sofas, and she did make banners and flags and other soft textile goods. It's so fascinating to me that these two people would come down to us as the representative figures of America's revolutionary era. And I think the reason for that is partly because craft itself is so bound up with that time. As I'll get to in a minute, of course, what happens very soon afterwards is that the Industrial Revolution really washes over the country like a tidal wave and totally transforms the nature of the economy. So there's that. But I think it's also that the artisan serves a central role in American culture, other cultures as well, but I think especially ours because of the nature of American immigration and expansion, the frontier experience, many other reasons too. The artisan serves a kind of critical role as the anchor of community. So the reason that Paul Revere was sent out on the midnight ride to warn everyone the British are coming is that he was already respected as a silversmith. The reason that it was so easy to recruit Betsy Ross into this patriotic story of America's founding symbolism is because she was a craftsperson, and therefore she seemed like an upstanding citizen, somebody who was trustworthy. Whereas people who work in factories, this is a picture of an interior of a factory from the 1830s from Lynn, Massachusetts, and then on the right, an early photograph of two of the women that would have worked in a factory like this. They do not have that role. They are almost considered debased, de-skilled, miserable, and in fact, they were working terrible jobs in terrible conditions, loud, dangerous, very long hours, very little pay, only marginally better lives than the farms that they were escaping to work in these factories, which of course were even more precarious economically, which drove them into the arms of capitalists who were building textile mills and other large-scale manufacturing concerns. So the shift of the economy from craft to industry is about more than the introduction of the machine. It's about more than the introduction of efficiency, large-scale capitalism, corporations, all the things that we of course know all about now, talk about all the time. It's also a shift away from artisan-led communities, cities and towns with artisans at their heart, to a situation where that role is essentially unoccupied. And I think that in the grandest sense, really macroscopically, looking at this super big picture, if we think about America today as a divided country, and a country that feels often at odds with itself and like it has no stable center, no shared culture that unites it, so a kind of disunited states, and I'm sure most of you would probably agree or to some extent register with that description or resonate with that description. We can say that the absence of craft in that key role, that kind of idea of craft as an adhesive of our culture, is a very grave loss indeed, and has a lot to do with a lot of other kinds of history, including of course the histories around gender and race. And that's what I'm going to go on to talk about now. Again, many avenues through this book, talk about lots of things. I talk about the history of labor unions, of course, talk about craft revivals like the arts and crafts movement and the studio craft movement. But what I wanted to particularly emphasize with you today is the significance of craft in the stories of Native Americans, African Americans, and women. So these three demographics who, of course, between them make up the absolute majority of the country. If you think about it, women are already half. And so if you also add male Native Americans and African Americans, you're talking about many more than a majority of the country. And yet these are demographics that have been consistently relegated, oppressed in horrendous ways, obviously, especially during the period of slavery, but also the period of Jim Crow in the case of African Americans. And when it comes to Native American culture, a sort of poisonous brew of genocide and assimilation and forced removals. And so, and then of course there's the sexism and patriarchy that has been subjected to women through the course of American history as well, including Black women and Native women. So here too, we can see that craft has an absolutely critical role in defining identity both from within these communities and also from the outside. And this to me is really the most important sense in which I want to talk about the real and the ideal of craft, because often craft is appearing in that double guise, both as an actual pot in the hands of a maker. This is Nampeo, the great Pueblo potter of the late 19th century, and in a way, typically romanticizing photograph taken by a white male photographer. So it's a kind of transcription of sentiment and nostalgia, this sort of soft lighting, kind of primitivizing gaze, you could say, perhaps. And yet also there's something real happening, which is Nampeo's making, her skill, the physicality of the pot, the real suturing of that object into the native community. And there are many other images like this. This is a particularly powerful one, I think. It's of a man that we only know as Slender Maker of Silver, an amazing sort of artistic name that he was known by. And he's commemorated in this portrait, which, like the portrait of Nampeo, presents itself as an image of extreme authenticity. So he's got this belt made of it, by his own hands, of silver across his lap, surrounded by and wearing other articles that he's made. And so your first impression is, okay, this is a, quote, traditional native silversmith. Now, in fact, what you're looking at is a totally staged photograph, first of all. So actually that blanket and the cactus and even the backdrop are props and sort of painted scenery in a photographer's studio. And moreover, probably that studio, as far as we can tell, was located at a US Army base, because that's where the majority of the client base for silversmiths like Slender Maker of Silver would have been. Also, it's important to note that the actual silver works that he's made were calculated for that market, for a kind of mestizo, that is to say, partly Mexican, partly white clientele. So that concho belt form, for example, that he's got over his lap was invented by his generation. In fact, people just like him. So to say that this is a picture of a traditional artisan is really in no way accurate. What you're actually looking at is a picture of somebody who's very deeply involved in a modern conflict of cultures and who's innovating as a way of establishing position within those cultures. So here we see this idea of the idea and the real coming into some kind of complex relationship with one another. It's also a story that had, tragic and real consequences for younger Native Americans. And here I'll just briefly refer to the story of the Carlisle Indian School, which is a deeply tragic story. This was an institution located in Pennsylvania that became the model for many other schools, both in America and actually in Canada as well, that took Native Americans, as they said in those days, away from the blanket, meaning out of their indigenous communities, and forced them into these basically white normative culture schools. And this image is the same person who's being shown dressed in his original Navajo attire, and then in this supposedly proper attire, as you can see 3 years later. So a picture of assimilation, sort of job done from the point of view of the people who did this to him. But these schools, well, first of all, were actually, although somewhat inadvertently, turned into death camps because tuberculosis and other disease ravaged the students who came there, because of course those diseases were not commonplace on the reservations where their families had been relocated to. And also it's important to know, from my purposes, that they were also craft schools. So the way that these young men and women were being assimilated was actually by teaching them industrial trades. They were called industrial schools for that reason. Very much paralleling, incidentally, what happened to African Americans at the same time. And this is, again, a fascinating story, which I can only tell in very brief form. But one of the things that happened in African American intellectual circles after the Second World War is that there was a very intense debate about the question of education. And essentially it rotated around the question of whether young Black men and women, especially in the South, so children of men and women who had been enslaved, whether those people should be given broad intellectual opportunities, so taught in humanities and sciences and so on, or whether they should only be taught manual trades. And ultimately, it came down to a kind of argument between the two most famous intellectuals of the late 19th century, Booker T. Washington, who was very in favor of this kind of manual training as a means of uplift, as he would have said. So a kind of pathway to economic wherewithal for these Black young men and women. And then against him was pitched W.E.B. Du Bois, the great sociologist, who himself exemplified the possibilities of Black intellectualism as a trained social scientist. And this is one of many charts that he made for the 1900 Paris Exposition, showing the state of affairs for African Americans, or as he would have put it, Negroes, using the language of that time. And you can see that industrial schools, which is to say craft schools, slightly confusing nomenclature, but what they're meaning there is manual training or vocational education, vastly outweighs the opportunity that are given to to students in other fields. And you can see, only 2 in business, over 2,200 in these vocational trades. And, the argument was a really difficult one, and probably remains a difficult one. If you're looking at somebody from an underprivileged background, from whatever ethnicity, what kind of education should you make available to them? Let's say you're a foundation, you have money to invest, which was very much what Booker T. Washington was doing. He was channeling white foundation money into the South. If you are a government official, if you are in fact an educator yourself, should you offer students the opportunity to get craft training on the theory that it might lead them to a productive line of work? Or should you offer them, in a way, the more risky pathway of humanities training on the grounds that if you only teach Black people and Native Americans vocational skills, then you'll create a permanent manual underclass? And as I say, in many ways, these arguments remain with us today because we still live in a racially unequal society. And all those questions are shot through contemporary debates about vocational education, and they date back, as you can see, more than 100 years. I just wanted to say quickly, though, that there's another variable here, which is gender. And I've already shown the picture of Nampeo. This is Maria Martinez, who in many ways was a kind of successor of hers. A very powerful form giver as a potter, working in the early stage of her career with her husband, Julian Martinez, and then after Julian's death with her son, Popovida. And like Nampeo, she was creating her own idiom of ceramics on the basis of archaeological fragments that were being found by both native and white archaeologists in the pueblos where she lived. But she and her husband, Julian, basically forged this semi-invented vocabulary out of these ancient shards, developing this very distinctive black on black palette, as you can see on the right, which is not coincidentally entirely compatible with the Art Deco tastes of the 1920s, which is when they really perfected this idiom. And so rather like Slender Maker of Silver, it's a good example of the way that an artisan can, if you like, manipulate the idea of being traditional. And just again, parenthetically, this is a story that leads right into Stories of Modernism. The Museum of Modern Art itself had a show in 1940 about Native American art and culture. It's not the sort of thing we imagine MoMA as having done. We think it was all sort of tubular steel chairs and Picasso paintings, but they were very, very involved with both folk or vernacular art and also with Native culture at that time. And this kind of amazing picture of these Native artisans and artists being flown in for this event in 1940, I think really tells you the story in some ways about the kind of culture clash that we're talking about. And I almost think of this picture of, the plane and the Native people together as being like the DNA of that Maria Martinez pot. But the other reason that I bring her up is because women in American history have very rarely, until recently, been afforded the same opportunities in the fine arts and architecture, and of course other professional fields, as men of their own class and ethnicity. So when we think about the history of American craft, one of the things that we have to think about is that it is the means by which both people of color and women were able to involve themselves in the arts at all. And it's no coincidence for that reason that today the art world is starting to absorb more of these craft traditions and narratives into its makeup. The reason for that, I would argue, is that the art world is very belatedly waking up to the fact that they need to diversify. And if they're going to be looking at that in a historical dimension, then they need to start bringing craft to the table. Similarly, if they're looking at it in contemporary context, it's very likely that those craft traditions will have some kind of implication in those diversification efforts. So, the last chapter of my book is called Can Craft Save America? Which is maybe a somewhat overstated, but I think still a very interesting question. But you could equally ask, can craft save the art world by providing to it the diversity that it so badly needs? This picture shows a super, super interesting version of that narrative, and it was taken during the lead up to the passage of the women's right to vote, which, as you all know, because the anniversary just happened a couple of years ago, was in 1919 that amendment was finally passed, the 19th Amendment. And it shows Alice Paul there in the center sewing a star in conscious emulation, of course, of Betsy Ross on this ratification banner. The idea was that every time a state ratified the amendment, she would sew a star onto the fabric. And of course, there was always a photograph taken, put out in both the suffragette press organs and in the mainstream press. And it's a fascinating gesture because, of course, women were thought of as seamstresses, textile workers, as domestic laborers, always with a needle in their hand. And so here, even Alice Paul, and I don't know if you've heard of her, but she was the most important activist leader of the women's right to vote campaign, extraordinary person, is presenting herself in a manner that's almost analogous to the way that, let's say, the Girl Scouts at that same time would have been presented. Here you see a group of Girl Scouts with their semaphore flags, signaling flags that they would have made themselves, for a badge, as it were. So this idea of sewing as a proper female occupation is appropriated by Alice Paul and her colleagues as a way of projecting, again, a kind of upright citizenship in the context of this very charged political debate. Then, of course, World War II comes along, and I'm sure you all know this part of the story. Women suddenly flood into the industrial workplace, not in the sense that they had in the early textile mills, but in very highly paid, trained occupations, which of course they need to rapidly learn and are able to learn in a period of months and years, as a way of forwarding the war effort. And of course, the indelible symbol of this is Rosie the Riveter, who you see there on the left in the famous painting by Norman Rockwell, now in the Crystal Bridges Museum. And you can see that she even has a halo on top of her head, just above her face shield. And then she's got her riveting gun across her lap, almost like a rifle. She's got her lunchbox at her hip, and her loafered foot is planted right on a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf. So this is like hardcore propaganda that we're looking at. But isn't it fascinating how comfortable Rockwell was with showing this empowered, indeed muscular, almost Michelangelo-like woman with her ham sandwich and total disregard for traditional gender norms? It's not surprising that this poster that you see on the right by J. Abbott Miller, and very aware, by the way, here that I'm showing you two images of women by men. So again, that's the optic that we're in here. This poster, though, was recovered by feminists in the 1970s and somehow became associated with the idea of Rosie the Riveter, even though she's obviously not riveting anything and wasn't associated with Rosie at the time. And in fact, for what it's worth, this poster was hardly known at all during the war. It was very little seen, really only in one factory in Pittsburgh for a short time. But feminists laid their hands on it in the 1970s, realized the power of this image, and of course now it's on, many a dorm room wall. What happens, though, of course, is that as male GIs come back after the war, women are strongly encouraged, you could even say in a way politically obligated or forced back into the home. This is when we get the cult of Leave It to Beaver, indeed the cult of female domesticity. In a way, the riveter gun is taken out of their hands and the sewing needle is put back into them. And that leads me to this fascinating pair of images. I wonder if you recognize the woman on the left. That is Rosa Parks, who was, of course, the heroic initiator of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. And I think what most people don't know about that, everyone knows the story. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus and moved to the back because she said that she was tired from her long day at work. What people probably don't know is that she was on her home from a long day at work at a department store where she worked as a trained seamstress. And so that image in what looks to me actually like handmade clothing also, and I kind of wonder whether she might have made it herself, is fascinating as a kind of document of the civil rights movement. And it's also fascinating to note that the civil rights movement, both men and women involved with it, including Martin Luther King, by the way, were also very strongly allied with the labor union movement of the post-war era. That's that sort of bizarre surrealistic image on the right is a float for an international ladies garment workers union parade. And again, a kind of weird gender economy going on there, this sort of, showmanship of, this sort of like mannequin like woman in front of this gigantic sewing machine, but yet for the largest female labor union, and quite a radical labor union in some periods of its history at that. So you have this very interesting moment in the 1950s and 60s where craft is really strongly connected to the civil rights movement, very much connected to the labor union movement as well. And then just to kind of skip forward to towards the present, basically what happens is that all goes to hell. During the Nixon administration particularly, you start to have a development where the white working class is really cleaved from the Black working class, and also from the radical left. So these constituencies that had previously been allies both in craft and politically are really separated. The emblematic moment here, which again has symbolic registers as well as a very definite reality to it, is the hard hat riot of the early 70s, when a bunch of white construction workers came down and physically used wrenches and other construction tools and also their actual hard hats to bludgeon these people that they considered to be hippies who were involved in an anti-war protest. And so this is often taken as a kind of key moment in the division of the left politically. But you can easily see, I think, how this moment of two kind of craft ethics, the hippie commune craft ethic on the one hand, and the construction trades unionized craft ethic on the right, the incipient right, come to inform our present, or indeed our recent past. So if you think about the way that Donald Trump, in his political machinations, forwarded a language of America first, and also America as a kind of working class, coal mining, trades culture, that is right out of the Nixon playbook of, making an appeal to the working class, not on the basis of economic arguments, of course, but on the basis of kind of culture war argument. And it was fascinating to me to discover this image of a woman called Betty Alexander, who, by the way, just passed away earlier this year. But right at the beginning of the Trump presidency, she made this quilt for him as a gift, and she was from South Bend, Indiana. And it was actually ultimately given to the senator of Indiana, who's who you see here. So this is the quilt sort of arriving, and it's just a really great reminder that craft does extend all the way across the political spectrum. And so, for someone of my political sympathies, I don't exactly warm to this example as another successor to Betsy Ross, and, think about the kind of bitter irony of Alice Paul making a flag, given what she represents, as opposed to what obviously Betty Alexander is lending her skill and name to here. But it is very interesting, isn't it, that craft does serve such similar roles for people across that political spectrum, and that in a way, maybe we should look at an example like this as kind of encouragement to think about engaging and maybe considering craft as a possible common ground again. As I said at the beginning of the talk, craft is often thought of as really a glue, if I could put it that way, or an adhesive in 18th century culture. And I do wonder, and I'll just leave it here, this kind of strange image, in a way quite haunting image, of craft in the hands of this man, this political, entity. I wonder whether in some funny way, whether this isn't telling us the real power of craft as a possible way to heal a divided nation as well. So when I posed that question as the last chapter of my book, Can Craft Save America? This is kind of what I was thinking about. The fact that wherever you go in the country, no matter who you talk to, no matter what gender, what race, what class, whether they're native born or immigrant, no matter what their political beliefs, probably they'll have somebody in their family that knows how to make something, or they'll be a craftsperson themselves. And it's at least a way to get a conversation started, and maybe more than a conversation. And that is obviously something that will have to happen initially on the level of the ideal, the symbolic register, but maybe it can gradually become a new reality for us as well. Okay, that's what I'm going to say. Thank you very much, Anya. I welcome your questions.
Hi, Glenn. Thank you so much for your talk. One of the first things, I have so many questions for you, but I'm going to try to streamline them so that we have time for Q&A with the audience too. But one of the questions I want to ask, because it's interesting, as you know, we have the Center for Art Research here on campus. And we think about art research and what that looks like. And I'm curious to hear what your kind of research methodology was to collect all of this information for this project that you've done. And to think about that related to art research maybe a little bit also. I'm just really curious about the difference between art historical research and art research, or the similarities too. But just to also understand that methodology and think about those archives that you were going through. And I'm sure so much of that information that you were kind of combing through is undocumented. So I'm curious, I'm just very interested in what that kind of research practice looked like.
Yeah, sure. So first, credit where credit is due. I had an amazing research assistant, Forrest Pelsu, who's a young design historian, so I want to give her some credit. And she did help me find a lot of archival material, particularly. So I didn't do it wholly alone. That's the first thing to say. This is obviously a huge research project. I guess maybe the most interesting thing for me, just thinking about that, because of course I was finding all kinds of sources that were very period specific. You get to the 1950s and you're reading hot rod magazines, kind of depends what you're looking into. But I think that the thing that struck me most forcefully is that I was interested not as much in objects, which has been the previous emphasis of craft histories, if you like, or museum catalogs, let's say. But I was really interested in the stories of craftspeople from their own perspective, because what I was really trying to do was give a voice to America's artisans and in a way retell the story of America through their eyes, if you like. So what that meant in practice was that I was actually relying on some pretty unorthodox, or at least I should say exceptional sources. In other words, an autobiography by Elizabeth Keckley, let's say, who was, this now famous seamstress who ended up living in the Lincoln White House after having been born into slavery. She's in some ways could stand in for the many, many, many thousands of Black women who worked as seamstresses and also were enslaved. But she's the only one that ended up in the White House, and she's the only one, not the only one, but one of very few who wrote an autobiography that was published. So it's like, again, that real ideal thing. Often what I was using in terms of actual research material was pitched in that symbolic key, but what I was trying to get at was the more typical experiences that lay behind those documents.
And then what do you do? I think about this as an artist doing research that, sometimes when the thing you're looking for isn't there, what do you do in that circumstance? Or does that, how does that even happen to you? What does that kind of look like?
Oh, well, I think if you're a good researcher, that doesn't happen to you, if I understand the question. Because I think what you do is go into the archive, whatever you think your archive is. It could be interviews, could be an actual paper archive, could be images, whatever. And what you really want to do is go in with an open mind and let the material speak to you and sort of push you around Because if you find yourself pushing your own research materials around, then you're probably making a mistake. And I realize, obviously, being a historian is not some kind of exercise in objectivity. It's shot through with opinion and subjective point of view, of course. But what you really want to do is, as much as possible, hold back your assumptions and even what you would be interested in finding until you've actually got the stuff in front of you, and then not let that shape your approach and your beliefs about it. And I can say that definitely happened with this book. I mean, although I did write it essentially during the period of the Trump presidency, I didn't actually totally set out to write a book that was so much about particularly racial diversity and was sort of a history of American race, which so many American histories are. But when I started looking at the kind of record, I thought, well, there's really no other way to tell the story, so that was definitely history talking to me.
It's interesting, when I was reading the book, I was also listening to the 1619 Project podcast. And then I was also listening to a lecture of Aruna D'Souza, who wrote Whitewalling, on the reparative mode of writing, where she's using Ta-Nehisi Coates' case for reparations as the basis for her thinking, in part, and I'm really curious, because the project, maybe thinking about you and the project, I mean, it's so different than your other work in some ways it's also related, so I'm curious about the arc of that. But also, I'm curious how you think about your project sitting within the context of those other projects that are happening simultaneously. I'm curious about that. I'm curious about how you think about the idea of reparations as you write this text, if you do, or what's your lens. I'm curious about your lens related to this project. So if you're sort of in these archives and they're leading you in this way, and then you have this lens, and it shapes the way that the analysis or the kind of the book takes form. I'm just very curious about how you think about that.
Yeah. Well, I guess I think about it with a lot of humility, particularly when you mentioned Ta-Nehisi Coates. I mean, you couldn't ask for a voice of more kind of perception and authority on questions of racial justice. And I could never pretend to, in a way, be in that room, if you know what I mean. The way that I think about it is more that if you're a responsible historian writing about almost anything in America, but as it turns out, craft is a really powerful example of this, you can't ignore race as a dictating factor. So it's more that way around for me, rather than flattering myself as a middle-class white straight guy, thinking that I'm going to kind of ride in and be the person to tell everyone about diversity. That's not really the way that I think about it at all. I think of myself as learning from writers like Coates and many, many others, of course, historically too. Learning from Elizabeth Keckley, not just relaying her words, but also trying to understand them and her perspective and find some wisdom there. But I would not like to set myself up as some kind of arbiter of how to repair the grave injustices of the past and present. There, I feel like I'm much more of like a citizen. I do think that reparations would be one of the most effective as well as ethically just ways to address some of the histories that I've been writing about, but I wouldn't necessarily feel that I'm more qualified to speak to that than anyone else. Maybe a little less qualified than many others.
Aruna D'Souza talks about the idea of, just to not sort of recommit, the crimes of the past, that she, first of all, assumes like a Black or a person of color reader. And I think that's a really interesting lens to think about writing those kinds of histories. And so actually she wouldn't explain the history of something that like a Black population might naturally understand. And so she wouldn't kind of go into describing what that means. It would just assume the reader knows what that is, or not describe systemic, racism, that's something that the reader would be familiar with. And then she'd also, so I'm curious about this too, I've heard you talk about this before, but she foregrounded the voices of the people she's representing rather than the voice of her own analysis. So I think that's really interesting too.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, also, you mentioned this is quite different from my other work. And And I think that's especially true of my earlier work, like Thinking Through Craft or The Invention of Craft.
Mhm.
Those are really quite academic books with like theory and stuff. And nothing wrong with that, obviously. And I still love thinking in that way. But I was writing a trade book for Bloomsbury, which, as I always like to say, also publishes Harry Potter. So
Oh,
it's obviously not the same thing at all. But I was trying to write for the general public,
mhm.
not a specific demographic, not even makers. You could think about maybe like there's some less charged version of the Irina de Souza idea where a book about craft should be written first and foremost for makers, but I wasn't really even doing that. I was really writing for anybody who kind of cares about this from any direction. And
Mhm.
so for me, the way to do that effectively was by essentially stringing together a lot of fascinating biographies, like capsule biographies, stories of individual makers, and then weaving those into a kind of broader fabric.
Mhm. I do really appreciate how you sort of you synthesize all of these extremely disparate histories and sort of make sense of them in ways where, there were things you were talking about where I was like, oh, that's why that happens, in the field of craft now. I mean, I can't exactly remember, but I just, there's ways that you sort of piece things together that is, yeah, really fascinating for me as a reader. I'm curious actually to think about you talk a lot about you're sort of this one of the histories that you're weaving together is like the history of studio craft, the kind of history of artisans, industry, and then I think about product design sort of moving, as you talk about Cranbrook. And so I was just thinking about those different histories. And yeah, I'm just curious to hear more from you about how you think about those overlapping histories. That's where it was starting to make some sense for me. I think about teaching our product design students and craft students and art students and all of, what to make sense of that for potentials for the field of craft. So can you talk about that a little bit, the differences and similarities between, those things, or that arc between those things?
Yeah, so I describe those as the two key revival movements, the arts and crafts movement and the studio craft movement. And I think maybe for some readers, the most surprising thing about this book is that there's so little about those two stories, frankly. I really, really decentered them, partly because they're white middle class phenomena, and partly because they're kind of tiny. We think about them a lot. And of course, they had a lot to do with setting up the academic framework in which obviously everyone at PNCA and the University of Oregon who's in a craft program is still working, right? But if we take a step back and think about the history of labor unions, about the history of domestic labor, about the history of enslavement, about the history of education, about the history of forced relocation and reservation and the economies there, you realize that the revival movements are really the sideshow. And
Mhm.
don't have a lot of involvement, certainly don't have a lot of diversity within them. And I really didn't want to I didn't want to give them center stage because I didn't think that was accurate. But at the same time, I hope that telling those broader stories helps you understand why those movements did come along in the form that they took. And that's maybe more of a complicated story than we can get into. But what I was trying to do was really contextualize the leaning artistic crafts, including those of the present day, within this much broader context. And hopefully that will be useful.
Mhm. Um, Great. I'm wondering if we would be mindful of time and look at the Q&A. I mean, I still have more questions for you that I could just keep asking, but I'm going to take a look at the Q&A and just see, I haven't been looking at it yet, but see what kinds of things are coming in.
Oh, Namita's here.
Yeah, I just saw Namita's question actually, so I'll ask that one to start. So to return to Anya's question about research and archives and what the materials within shape or, and what the materials within shape or reveal as you work through them. How did your research work through the gaps and erasures in many archives? In other words, how did you work around the gaps in the archives themselves in your research?
Yeah. So first of all, Namita Wiggers, for those who don't know if that's possible, of course, formerly curator and then director at the wonderful Craft Museum there in Portland, and now running the fantastic MA program at the Warren Wilson College in North Carolina. And it's actually those students who coined the phrase "Can Craft Save America?" It was something that they had generated during a kind of brainstorming exercise in the first week of that course. So again, credit where credit is due. That's where that phrase comes from. So thank you, Namita, and thanks for tuning in also. It's a great question, and it's sort of the reverse of the question that you asked earlier, Anya, that when I was talking about craftspeople's voices and their stories. And I guess I want to say that this book didn't actually put me in that position as much, because it was covering so much ground that it was really much more a problem of which of the squillions of topics that I actually could have talked about should I, rather than being stared in the face by a hole and having to figure out how to fill it or how to work around it or just surface it. And I'm kind of keenly sensible to the slightly irresponsible way, that I'm describing that as a historian. But for sure, in a lot of other cases, I've had exactly the problems that Namita is describing, because if you're trying to deal with something comprehensively and definitively, rather than in this broader brush overview kind of way, you will often find that craft histories are not attested, do not have the documentary base. Craftspeople often didn't write things down apart from maybe, their, ledgers of outgoing expenses and incoming, incoming funds. So that's a real issue for our discipline methodologically. But I wouldn't say it's something that really haunted me as much in this book as some other things that I've worked on and I've seen many colleagues, including Bryan-Wilson, write about.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask another question that's related. You're touching on these things and we're sort of circling around the response, but as a follow-up to my question also on research and archive, what are your strategies to diversify and expand your search, given that traditional archives are oftentimes themselves biased, archiving only certain narratives? How do you push beyond what has been archived? If the material is not archived, if the biography is not written, are there any other ways to get to these histories?
Yeah, this is great. We're having such a intense conversation about historical methodology, which is not necessarily what I was expecting.
Yeah.
It's, of course, super interesting to me. Yeah, it's a very similar question in some ways to what Namita asked, although this question of how do you diversify the archive, I think, is a great way of putting it. And maybe the first thing I would say is that focusing on craft does that for you in a super powerful, floodgates opening way, which is parallel to what I was saying about the art world. The diversification of the art world offers all of these avenues of thinking and aesthetic accomplishment that had been previously excluded. And so suddenly you just feel like, the British phrase is you're spoiled for choice. Like you have so much to look at that you almost don't know where to start. And I think the same is true when you suddenly think about integrating all of these different kinds of archive, the voices of labor union organizers, as well as civil rights protesters, as well as, museum exhibitions about vernacular art, weaving them all together. So I think the most important thing for me in terms of that diversification strategy was simply to put craft center stage at all. I think beyond that, maybe I would say, just as a way forward, if you're not committed to this idea of using the voices of craftspeople to tell their own stories, which is really what I was trying to do in this book, I really do think that objects are still a massively underexploited resource. I mean, this is the core inside of material culture, that people who didn't leave behind written records often do leave behind objects. And there are lots of ways to get to mentality through those objects. And I still think that as much work has been done in that direction, there's still a lot more that is being done and will be done.
Can I ask this question, Glenn, actually, because this was something that I talked about with my students. We did a seminar about your chapter on Americana. And, we did wonder, with authenticity or innovation even as the hinge of your analysis, and the idea of indigenous artists, for example, manipulating the idea of being traditional, that analysis seems to come from a Western lens. So, we were curious, what does this history look like if it comes from an indigenous point of view, or what is your, as I was reading this text, I thought about that a lot, your lens and what that means related to writing this history. So, and my students also had lots of questions about that, especially with the image of Slender Maker of Silver and the way you kind of articulated that history around that work. So, yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, my reading of that is very indebted to a white British historian, Henrietta Lidchey, who,
Mhm.
of course, has done a huge amount of work with Native communities and learned from them, but is herself not from that community, for what it's worth. I mean, that's that's a great question or a great reaction, but I worry a little bit about suggesting that Native people weren't highly aware of these dynamics a long time before the the revival movements in the 1920s and 30s. So to imply that Native people wouldn't already have had an extremely overdetermined conversation amongst one another and also with oppressor white communities about precisely those issues would be gravely mistaken. So to assume that authenticity is sort of a white person's issue, that's just not true. You know, that
Mhm.
there's a huge amount of discourse around that question in the Native community, and of course it continues. You know, the so-called Red Power campaign of the 1960s, for example, super fraught debates about that of course mirror questions that are unfolding in the Black Power movement of the same time. So I think it's absolutely right, and I hope, you know, in lots of ways that I achieved this in the book, that you want to have like a polyvocal, multi-perspectival account that's looking at these problematics or dynamics from every direction you can. But I would, in that particular case, I would want to say, if you wanted to have a complex account of manipulation of authenticity, that you'd be just as likely to find it in the words of a Native author as a white one
Mhm.
or maker. Yeah.
Mhm. I have another question. Your book is tackling intersectional topics in craft in the US, like race, class, gender. Where do non-binary and trans people find themselves within your book and your conversations around gender within this context?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have to say I don't know that I actually foregrounded a trans related story or maker in the book. There's a lot of LGBTQ stories, of course. I think particularly, for example, of Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr, who were the leaders of Hull House. And that's a great example because everybody's heard of Jane Addams, but I don't know how many people know that she was, first of all, a lesbian, and second of all, that her partner, Ellen Gates Starr, who was also a book binder, was equally important in formulating the philosophy of that settlement house. And you know, many other examples like the AIDS quilt, which you mentioned Julia Bryan-Wilson earlier.
Mhm.
Very indebted to her work on that topic
Mhm.
in my treatment of that on the book. And of course, that's a very broad-based experience that would include a lot of non-binary and trans people.
Mhm.
I would definitely point to other scholars, though. I mean, John Chach's Queer Threads springs to mind as a really key source in that regard. Um, but I have to admit, I don't think that I included anything that was really on point to the question. But obviously, you know, super important question and something that rightly is being foregrounded in all sorts of areas of discourse now.
Mhm. I have a question from Jovencio de la Paz, my colleague in Fibers here that you know, but I'd like to read this one too. So he asks, I'm curious about the forum or venue upon which craft might provide common ground for, or quote unquote, common ground for politically polarized individuals. Does this occur within institutions that exist, like the academy or museum, or can we imagine any other venue that might be ripe for this common ground?
Yeah. Hello, Jovencio.
Mm.
One thing I haven't mentioned actually is that I have a show on right now in New York, which is called Objects USA 2020, and Jovencio is in it. So if people are interested, that's a show basically about the contemporary. You could kind of call it a craft revival, but it's maybe just taking the temperature of what's happening in craft and the arts and designs fields in comparison to what happened 50 years ago. So check that out. It's at our and Company Gallery. And great question, Evencio. You know, I think this is the classic example of progress needing to be made on all fronts simultaneously, which is why it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around it and get strategic about it. I think it's all but impossible for a centralized organization like, say, the American Craft Council to really engineer the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And I don't even necessarily think that a book like the one that I've written could have more than a very modest impact. Obviously, I'm trying to field the idea of craft as a kind of social connector. But I think what I'm describing is a little bit less engineered than that, less driven by some organization or elite voice like my own, than it is something that I perceive happening already at the grassroots level in craft-based business after craft-based business. You know, we haven't really talked about this that much, but I did write what I came to think of as a kind of extra chapter of the book for the Smithsonian magazine that came out in January that looked at this very broad range of educational and entrepreneurial phenomena in contemporary craft, and thinking of it as a kind of another craft revival, much digitally driven. And if people are interested in that, they could check that out. It's online. So
great, thank you. I'm just checking to see if there's other questions. And Glenn, you did mention like, oh, I didn't expect that, you know, you had ideas about things we might discuss that maybe we didn't address. Are there things that you would want to bring up now before I jump back into the Q&A from the audience?
Well, I mean, like I was saying about my archive, I probably didn't have that many preconceptions, but I think, you know, given that PNCA is with us, and obviously many people at UOregon are also involved as makers and innovators in the studio, I do think it is really interesting to consider what the possibilities of studio practice are now, especially given that we've all been kind of booted out of, or not me, but so many of us in the field have been booted out of our studios in the past year, and now we're maybe making our way back into them in the last few months. And you just realize how incredibly precious and powerful that space can be. And I guess, you know, just one quick thing that I would share about that is that this idea of the space in which craft is practiced, whether it's a shoemaker's 10-footer in the 18th century, or it is in fact a machinist shop in a factory in the 19th century, or it's a contemporary art school studio, that idea of a space apart that works differentially as a site of action from which to critique and engage is really worth pondering. And so again, thinking about the trajectories that lead into those studios as being not just other art studios, but also those other places in which skilled making happens. I feel like that's really important, and maybe, you know, could serve as a kind of pathway of research and inspiration for, you know, any artist working today, those connections.
Great. I think maybe that's I'm looking at the time and wanting to end in a timely way. I think that's a really nice way to end, Glenn. Thank you so much for being here with us today. It's been such a pleasure to have you here. And I always really appreciate how open you are to questions. And it's just been really great to have you here. And thank you, audience, for your excellent questions too. That was nice to hear those as well. Okay, Glenn, thanks so much. Take good care. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. Thank you, Sarah Houston and PNCA as well. Take care. Okay, bye-bye.